So we're going to talk about some of the history that loads towards actual diagnosis, and then we're going to cover a few of those diagnoses in this video. So disorders have been around for a long time, but back in the early days, they were explained primarily by supernatural classifications. So people that might have had odd behavior or outside of the norm, we call that abnormal behavior, they were thought of to have been maybe possessed by spirits, thought of to be witches or anything related to that. Treatments then would be of the spiritual nature, and we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But when you think about how far we've come, most people these days with a mental health issue, they are thought of from a very different frame. We've come a long way from thinking about things in that primarily spiritual consideration. So some of the history related to this, remember that biopsychosocial and spiritual frame. Well, spiritual was there in the beginning, and what we see that changed and influenced how we look at what's going on with individuals is biology started becoming much more clear. As science and techniques within science improved, we started understanding more of what's really going on with individuals. As we look at disorders these days, we look at what's going on physiologically, both in just the balance of the chemistry, also genetics that could play into what's going on. There are definitely individuals with predispositions to certain disorders. Things that put people at risk for acquiring disorders could be in that social situation. And we'll cover disorders that fall into all of those categories as we move forward with this video. One of the things to understand when we look at someone that's got a disorder, or we wonder if we're somebody who might acquire a disorder, is that there is something called the diathesis stress model. You may, or I may, have some genetic inheritance that sets us up to be vulnerable to something. And in the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances, there may be the right amount of stress that pushes someone into acquiring those kinds of situations for themselves, the way they think, the way they behave, the way they function. We know that, for example, schizophrenia is something that has a significant genetic predisposition. People inherit a vulnerability to acquire schizophrenia. Just because parents have schizophrenia doesn't mean all of their children will acquire schizophrenia. There's even a case where there were quadruplets, 4 sisters that were born. All 4 actually did acquire the schizophrenia, but in very different levels of intensity. And when we think about what was going on for those 4 women, some of them had greater stress, some of them had greater social support based on some of the aspects in their environment. All of them had a predisposition. Now, you might look at some of your family history and wonder, wow, what is it that my parents and my grandparents have shared with me? But recognize what we talked about in the last chapter in terms of managing stress, managing lifestyle, and managing health can all play a huge factor in what actually happens in your diathesis stress to a potential diagnosis. That leads us to the disorders. We're going to start with anxiety. Lots of us experience things called anxiety or fear, and fear and anxiety are not the same thing. Fear is a triggering response to an event that catches you feeling unable to manage. Anxiety is an apprehension, it's an avoidance, it's a chronic low-level component for individuals to deal with. So recognize that this imminent threat is something tied to fear. Anxiety frequently doesn't have a trigger or an event that's real clear or specific. One of the things to be aware of with anxiety disorders, there's a number of them, specific classifications. We're going to only cover a couple of them. But 25 to 30% of all United States citizens will acquire some aspect of an anxiety disorder in their lifetime. That's a significant portion of our population. Now, those numbers may not seem very large, but when you think about how many people live in the US, that's hundreds of thousands of individuals. And one of the key components related to mental health disorders, especially anxiety disorders, is they tend to be comorbid with other components. As I mentioned in the last video, comorbid with substance use disorders, and the combination can be lethal. We want to make sure that we help people as soon as we can identify situations so we can mitigate the long-term impact and the severe impact. With anxiety, identifying it early is helpful. What we do see with people with anxiety is long-term issues tend to create physiological responses like high blood pressure and heart issues, just like we saw with the other coping styles related to like a type A personality. So what are some of the specific anxiety issues? You probably know of phobias. There are a number of phobias that you'll find in that DSM. There are specific phobias. You've probably heard of arachnophobia, a phobia of spiders, or a phobia of heights. Any of those components are a phobia that's tied to a specific situation. And it's really not a problem for individuals if they can avoid those threatening stimuli. If you can live your life without having to be near spiders, you probably don't have something that's impacting your functioning, which means that you're not going to qualify for that diagnosis. But if you're finding that your fear of spiders is impairing your joy of going into the outdoors, you may want to figure out some ways to deal with that phobia. There are good treatments for phobia, and in fact, there are actually good treatments for a lot of the anxiety disorders, which is one of the encouraging components. When there's such a high percentage of individuals, we also have good efficacy of treatments. So phobias can be things that are acquired by a startling experience, or sometimes we don't know where they come from. I know of people that had no problem with spiders and then had a situation where maybe they got bit by spiders a lot because they ran into a lot of spiders, and then they had a significant response, and they learned in that process that spiders are a threat. That's how we understand most phobias develop. Another anxiety disorder that we consider is panic disorder. And panic is that sense of impending doom. Individuals with panic attacks feel like they're dying. Their entire body is reacting as if everything is out of control in response to fear. And typically there's no clear sense of that threat, but they feel that it's imminent. And what happens is that can go on for up to 20 minutes. The body can be in that heightened reaction response. Panic disorder frequently has a history of panic attacks that then causes someone to be afraid of the next one, and afraid to the point of being disabled so that they don't have the ability to function in the ways that they want to. That then builds into something that causes them to have trouble working and having a full life with the relationships that they want to have with family and friends. So panic disorder is a significant impairing component for individuals that are dealing with that aspect of panic. There are a number of other anxiety disorders, but the last one I want to talk about in this video is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I'm sure that you've heard about either post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. It was something that was named in the 1970s, primarily starting with individuals returning from war having these incredibly intense symptoms of invasive memories, heightened vigilance to what's going on, and a lot of bad dreams and other anxious responses. And it's past the time when that's a normal response. What we found is that PTSD can be acquired by anyone. There are certain people that are going to be more predisposed, have a diathesis stress predisposition towards it. And that's something to maybe consider as you enter into high stress jobs, because that can set you up for more likelihood of PTSD. PTSD is disabling because individuals learn how to cope in a situation that requires intense responses, intense vigilance, and intense coping. But when they get out of that situation, now they're in a place that is not requiring those heightened responses. They don't know how to remove themselves from those coping skills. They get trapped in an over responsive to a threat that's not even present anymore. And that cycle can disrupt life significantly for individuals experiencing that. We have increasingly improved treatments for individuals with PTSD, and that's very exciting as we find more and more individuals are dealing with PTSD. There's the ability to help them, and that's what we're looking for in psychology. That sets us up for the next group, which is called mood disorders. And you've probably heard of these also. The first one is depression. There's more than one depressive disorder, but I want to talk about major depression. Major depression is that disorder that overwhelms an individual to the point where they may not be able to think well. Their mood is very bleak. They aren't having much joy in life. They may have suicidal ideation. They also are maybe not taking care of themselves. This is obviously going to impact their level of functioning. Many times people with very severe depression are unable to go to work or school, unable to even get out of bed. So that is major depression. Another mood disorder is bipolar disorder. And there are two types of bipolar disorder, but the thing to understand about bipolar disorder is that it's going to have not just a depressive side to it, but it's going to cycle into a manic side. And while being euphoric may be fun, we're talking about mania to the point where individuals are out of control, not thinking about consequences for their actions, and they can go on for a long time with little sleep, like 72 hours, which is going to actually increase the inability to think clearly and function clearly. So we have bipolar, which is between a depressive and a manic phase, and then we have major depression or depression in some of the other categories. So that's just a unipolar disorder. Those are what are captured under mood disorders, and they do respond to treatment, and there are good treatments out there. And what we find is that individuals respond best when they decide they're ready for treatment. I did mention with major depression that suicidal ideation is a component. Suicidal ideation is also part of bipolar disorder. And while suicide and suicidal ideation are not a diagnosis in the DSM or the ICD, they are symptoms and very serious. And we want to understand that suicidal ideation is not something to be taken lightly. If someone is talking about not wanting to live any longer, if someone is talking about thoughts of wishing that they could be gone, that's something that we need to listen to carefully. You may not be the person to deal with it, though. It's not always your job to help them, but it may be something that you can take to an adult you trust who's knowledgeable, who can help you help this person you're aware of that's dealing with suicidal ideation. A lot of things can contribute to suicidal ideation. Hopelessness and helplessness are the two experiences that are the most prominent for individuals to set them up. A cycle of this is never going to end, and a cycle of I don't have what it takes to deal with this are part of those hopeless and helpless situations that people feel in response to big stressors. But suicidal ideation can be dealt with, and it takes us listening and caring and willing to help people find the resources they need. Another disorder that shows up, I've already mentioned, which is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, like bipolar disorder and major depression, has a high rate of suicidal ideation. And it's because individuals with schizophrenia feel like this is really a trap and that there's not a lot of way out. What we do know about schizophrenia is that it affects 1% of the population worldwide. This is why we know that it's a genetic and biological component, not an environmentally induced component. Additionally, in recent years, we've understood more about what's going on in the brain at this point. And what we see is that there's significant deterioration in the brain gray matter for those that are experiencing schizophrenia. Schizophrenia tends to show up around age 18 to 25. And what we see then is that in typical situations, particularly in the United States, that's when young people are moving out and living on their own or moving away from their family. And what we need to understand is how to identify abnormal thinking sooner, because treatment works better the sooner we catch those things. So what are some of the symptoms that would show up, the experiences that would show up with someone with schizophrenia? First of all, are hallucinations. Hallucinations are false experiences. What's really going on is the brain is being triggered to hear things, to see things, to feel things, to taste things, to smell things by malfunctioning brain processes. But those are believed to be true. So individuals with schizophrenia have hallucinations. They're seeing things, they're hearing things, tasting things, experiencing things that aren't there. Delusions are also a part of schizophrenia, and those are false beliefs. Frequently, those are going to be false beliefs of maybe the individual sees themselves as grandiose. Frequently, they have a religious component, so they may be a religious leader. Some even think they're a prophet or Jesus himself. And we can hear those false delusional ideas and think that this is someone who is crazy. And yet, if you recognize what's going on in their brain, they are not choosing this. It is a malfunction in their brain processes. Other components that are elements of schizophrenia are disorganized speech, disorganized thought. They're going to be very hard to understand, especially as the schizophrenia progresses, particularly if it's untreated. Treatment does help, but it cannot be stopped. Schizophrenia is a disease. It's lifelong. Often it can go into remission with good treatment. However, there's some paranoia that tends to show up for those with schizophrenia, and they aren't always willing to participate in treatment actively and consistently. That's why earlier intervention is so important, particularly for those with schizophrenia. The next category is personality disorders. Personality disorders are a way that an individual operates in the world, and it is an established pattern early in life. They were set apart in the diagnostic framework found in the DSM-4, and the DSM-5 has them much more merged with the rest of the disorders. Part of the change in the way that was played out is that we originally, back in like the DSM-3, 1980s time, thought that personality disorders would not respond to treatment. So what are some of the personality disorders? Well, you might have heard of some of those. They would be perhaps a paranoid personality or narcissistic personality. There's also something called avoidant or dependent personality disorder. We're going to talk about a couple of them. We're going to talk about borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is often misunderstood. For individuals with borderline personality disorder, they actually are experiencing an inability to manage their emotions. And you might know people that you're like, well, this is someone that's like that. And I'm not talking about they're pretty emotional. I'm talking about they can't figure out what's stable. They go back and forth inside. They have a lack of consistency and a lack of cognitive clarity about what they're experiencing. Now, remember, personality disorders are evident earlier in life. You're going to be able to see patterns of this showing up by middle school, high school, and early adulthood. Frequently for individuals who are identified as having borderline personality traits, you can see that going back even farther. And they often are coming from family situations that were unstable. So if you think of someone growing up in a situation where they don't know what is solid ground, what is stable, they don't know how to develop that in themselves. And as they grow up, particularly if it was really chaotic, they're still looking for that solid ground. And these are individuals that can come across as incredibly needy because they're looking for that stability in their interactions with other people. So borderline personality doesn't mean they're on the border. It means that they are not on one side solid or one side solid. They're flipping back and forth in how they experience the world, how they feel about the world, and how they think about the world. And that's why it's called borderline. At this point, the rates of borderline prevalence are about 1.4% of the US population. There are more females diagnosed with borderline personality disorder than males, but actually that's because more females ask for help than males do. And you're going to see that in a number of the disorders in the DSM, and as you cover this chapter, that more women are going to be diagnosed, but that's because more women in our culture have learned that it's okay to ask for help. And as we find new generations coming into the permission to ask for help, we're finding that gender distinction actually disappearing. The other personality disorder I want to talk about is antisocial personality disorder. Now you might be thinking there are people that don't like social interactions because that's what antisocial sounds like, but that's actually asocial. Asocial are individuals that don't seek out social interactions. Antisocial is a term that the diagnostic manual uses for individuals who actually don't enter into interactions socially with the same ability to have empathy for other people. Empathy is the ability to understand another person's experience. And with someone who doesn't have that ability, they may come into this with complete disregard for another person's experience in that interaction. So what we see with antisocial personality is that we have a number of individuals coming in without compassion, without empathy, without the ability to really care about another individual's experience. Now, this is where you might think psychopath. And yes, a psychopath or psychopathology is part of antisocial personality disorder for some, but they're not the same. A psychopath is inherently looking to cause harm to other people. Antisocial personality is that setup where they just disregard. So their moving forward with life is not thinking about how their actions are going to affect another person. This can be problematic if you're the person interacting with them because they aren't considering the impact and you may be experiencing a lot of impact. Now, be aware that people with antisocial personality disorder can mimic compassion, can mimic empathy, so they can be very charming. But the intent behind that is to get what they want, not to engage in a good relationship. And one of the most distressing components about antisocial personality disorder is for those individuals that have that and they're very bright and they also have learned those mimicking behaviors of being charming, they tend to move into leadership roles, and you may find them in a lot of places running companies, sometimes running religious organizations, in politics, and in other power places. And they may load towards getting what they want without regard for other people. The last group we want to talk about is neurodevelopmental disorders. There's a lot of other disorders that you can explore in the DSM and in your reading of the chapter. But what we see in neurodevelopmental disorders is these start early in life. I'm going to cover just two, and there are two that are commonly heard about, but maybe not commonly understood. The first one I want to talk about is ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. There's actually three categories of that. There's someone that has attention problems, impulsivity problems, or inattentiveness problems. But frequently that hyperactive is a overload or a set apart component for an individual. Not all people with ADHD have that hyperactivity. A number of people have the impulse component or the inattentive component, and they still have the same kind of problems that someone would if they have that hyperactivity. So when we think about ADHD, we actually have 5% of our children getting this diagnosis. And there have been some political statements that it's overdiagnosed. When we use good criteria from the DSM, we can identify who has ADHD. Now, there are other comorbid components to consider, like anxiety or a mood disorder like depression, because they can be part of ADHD. But what we want to understand with ADHD is it's actually a developmental component. The brain structures and functioning and the way that they're operating are not operating like a typical normal brain. What we have as an ability to focus in on content and choose to eliminate the other things is not possible for someone with ADHD. Every movement, every thought, every feeling that they have could be a distractor, and trying to stay focused takes a lot of energy. So the more exhausted that individual has, the more distracted they can be. This is going to impair learning, and the more severe that ADHD is, the more impacted they are going to be in situations around learning new information or new skills. While we think of this ADHD neurodevelopmental disorder as a child disorder, what we do see is that ADHD is not something that someone outgrows. What they tend to do is they learn how to cope. They either get treatment and use the treatment as an intervention to build those coping skills, or they live long enough to develop those coping skills more naturally. Now, there are some components of just the gradual aging process that give us the capacity for greater insight and greater skill building. But what we want to do is diagnose earlier so that we can set kids up for good positive social interaction and learning opportunities, because that's what helps them succeed more effectively through life. So early diagnosis is a good thing with something like ADHD. What causes ADHD? Well, we don't know for sure what causes most of these disorders, but with ADHD, there does seem to be some heredity components to it, and then the rest is up for grabs. Lots of components could be involved related to just the way the fetus developed. But to understand what's going on with that individual, etiology is not the only component. It's expression and here and now, recognizing how to provide the support, the intervention, the treatment, because individuals with ADHD can have very successful, high-functioning life. So the last disorder we're going to talk about is autism spectrum disorders. I mentioned them earlier. They've changed in the DSM-5. Now it's this whole category, and there's a whole spread. There is going to be high-functioning individuals with autism spectrum disorder, those that are going to be moderately impacted, and then severely impacted. When we think about those with autism spectrum disorder, we're talking about individuals that are going to have an inability to interact with their environment in the way that we consider fairly normal. They actually have similar impact to their brain as I described with ADHD, in that it's impacted at a structural and functioning level. They cannot process the intake of information in the same way. They get overwhelmed and overloaded. And frequently, they need to soothe themselves so they can find some grounding. So you'll find some responses are rocking back and forth, or some other fidgeting components to help themselves stay grounded and in their bodies in a way that feels like it's intact. But they don't have the ability then to communicate because of that same malfunctioning in the brain. And that's where you see a number of individuals with particularly moderate and severe levels not able to articulate, and that's going to impact relationships. Individuals with severe autism spectrum disorder are going to require specific care for all of their lives. This is not something that they develop out of. Moderate can become functioning, but it's going to take a lot of support. High-functioning individuals with autism spectrum disorder can lead relatively normal functioning lives. And in fact, we see a number of individuals in that higher functioning level having some incredible skills, sometimes to the point of being a savant, where they may have an expertise, a genius level in one area. What we want to understand is that those abilities to communicate, identify emotions, understand what another person's experiencing, and stay present in our body are all skills that require your brain to work well. For these individuals, they have impairment that gets in the way, and they're not doing any of these behaviors on purpose. They're just trying to function the best they can. So if you know someone on the autism spectrum and they have enough symptoms to be diagnosed, make sure you recognize they're doing the best they can. One of the things to understand about autism spectrum disorders, there's a lot of information out there of how it's been caused. There actually is no one etiology behind autism. We don't know what specifically causes it, but we do know that vaccines are not what causes autism spectrum disorder. So if you've heard anything about vaccines specifically being the cause, there is no research supporting the evidence of that. There is also no evidence that a whole array of other components do. What we know is that it's a multiple list of possibilities. Lead poisoning during development can be one contributor, but there's a lot of others. So there's no one way that we can stop this, and we need more information as we continue to develop the techniques of understanding what's going on in the brain. We'll be able to get more answers about the etiology. Disorders can be acquired. Disorders can be things we're born with. Disorders can be things that are expressed under certain stressful situations because there's a propensity or that diathesis stress component. Disorders are around us everywhere, and the likelihood that you or someone you know experiences some symptoms of these disorders is high in your lifetime. That doesn't mean you'll acquire a diagnosis, but it could mean that as you understand more about disorders, you'll understand that these are things that require increased compassion and increased learning so that we can be people that come alongside others with the skills to help and the ears to listen well to their experiences. That's psychological disorders.